We are a nation under God, and I believe God intended for us to be free.
I came here alone, and yet, because of the freedom of the country, because of the laws that allows us together to be able to survive, as long as you know that you have the skills, you are law-abiding, you are given the chance to flourish.
In a classroom in Brooklyn, the process of turning foreigners into Americans goes on.
Can you give me another question?
A class of eager applicants from many parts of the world get ready to become citizens.
Yes or no? When you are asked, why do you want to be an American citizen? These are the questions that they ask during the interview. Anyone who could share with us?
To convince the immigration officials, they must show a passable grasp of English and give signs of the patriotism expected of all good Americans. These include recognizing some of the songs that make the collective American heart beat a little faster. America is the only country in the world where everybody is descended from immigrants. Anglo-Americans, Irish-Americans, Italian-Americans, Spanish-Americans, African-Americans. It's a nation of hyphens. Even the Indians, the Native Americans, are actually immigrants too, since they migrated across the Bering Strait from Siberia into Alaska in prehistoric times. This sense of overlay and mixture and continuous superimposition is absolutely fundamental to the way that Americans imagine themselves. And it reached a kind of peak of intensity in the late 19th and early 20th centuries when floods of Europeans came across the Atlantic and transformed American culture. This is the most famous statue of a human figure in America, or perhaps the world. To incalculable millions of people over the last 100 years, it has meant freedom. It has meant America. Most people interpret this giant Amazon as a promise to the immigrant. And yet she was never meant to be a monument to immigration. She was a gift from France to America, celebrating not immigration, but revolution. The American Revolution of 1776 as a forerunner of the French one 13 years later. She was designed by a French sculptor called Bartholdi and engineered by Gustave Eiffel, who built the tower in Paris. Her subject was not America welcoming the exile, but liberty enlightening the world. The 7 rays of her crown indicating the 7 continents. She is not a hospitable nymph. She is hefty and stern, and her gaze says, "Watch it, Buster," not "Welcome, stranger." She may not be a great work of art, but as an emblem, she's incomparable.
Well, for my grandparents, my family, the Statue of Liberty was what they saw when they came over here and were realizing the dream of coming to a better place. From what I remember, my grandparents described seeing the statue as a really emotional moment when they came over here. It represented like the fruition of their dreams. They were finally here, and now their whole new life was going to start. And I think it held that for a lot of people.
It would be a totally different thing if it was a statue of a man. It wouldn't symbolize the same thing. I think usually the woman is the mother figure, the one who welcomes people more, the hostess, that kind of a thing. than the man.
I wanted them to see it for themselves. Lauren and Erica are learning a lot about their country right now in school, and I think this kind of adds to their education, just seeing the Statue of Liberty and knowing that their freedom cannot be frustrated. And that's what the Statue of Liberty says to me, and I hope it says that to my daughters.
Why did Ms. Liberty become associated with immigration? Because in This is the Immigration Hall of Ellis Island in New York Harbor. Here, the old world was sorted, inspected, classified, deloused, renamed, and then released into America. It's a museum now, and for all who value the plural and the various over the singular and the uniform, this is, and has to be, a sacred spot. There were no guarantees, and in the process, they created the cluster of ethnic villages known as modern New York. Nowhere in the world were there worse extremes of wealth and poverty than in 19th century New York. It was beyond Dickens, beyond Calcutta. In the 1880s, 334,000 people were crammed into a single square mile of the Lower East Side, making it the most densely populated place on Earth. Less than 10 square yards of urban space per person, including the sidewalks and streets. They were packed into filthy, disease-ridden tenements, 10 or 15 to a room, and the well-off knew nothing about them and cared less. Into the purgatory of the tenements came a Danish immigrant with a camera. His name was Jacob Riis, and he changed the social conscience of New York. Before leaving for America, Riis spent his last $40 on a pistol to defend himself against the Indians and bisons he thought he'd find on Broadway. But he found something very different and shot it with a camera. He became America's first crusading photographer. Riis disclosed the teeming labyrinth of the city, the human cost on which the plutocracy of New York's Gilded Age relied. He was the first documentary photographer to use flash. He threw light, literally, into dark corners. I wanted to show, he said, as no mere description could, the misery and vice that I have noted in my 10 years of experience and suggest the direction in which good might be done.
They worked in the same place where they lived, you see. And the kids of 6 or 7 would pick the threads out of the garments, that sort of thing. It was part of their work, you see. And even though they stopped for prayer 3 times a day, there was not much joy in it. That around this time, there was such fear of this immigration. A lot of people started talking about giving intelligence tests and psychological tests of the incoming immigrants. It was the poverty, it was the foreignness that bothered them. But above all, I think it's fair to say these people had no tradition which they could literally bring into the American picture.
Riis shared some of those prejudices. He viewed his subjects as specimens who had to be displayed for the ultimate good of their own class. He didn't ask permission. He burst in the middle of the night like a cop with a camera. The results are like images of befuddled animals in their dens. New York was a city in continuous convulsion, Baghdad on the subway, one writer called it. It was the urban frontier, more real to most Americans than the vanished frontier out west. The painter who led the depiction of this tough, exuberant city was a son of a riverboat gambler who'd killed a man in Nebraska and fled east. His name was Robert Henri. He'd learned about realism at the Philadelphia Academy and in Paris. He was a charismatic teacher, and he'd acquired a circle of younger artists who were as committed as he was to painting the human clay, the streets and slums of New York. There is only one reason for art in America, he said, and that is that the people of America learn the means of expressing themselves in their own time and their own land. Because of their desire to tell some truths about the dirty city, Henri's group was nicknamed the Ashcan School. They spurned academic painting. They disliked Impressionism as an art of mere surfaces. Henri wanted art to be akin to journalism. He wanted paint to be as real as mud, as the clods of horseshit and snow that froze on Broadway in the winter. As real a human product as sweat, carrying the unsuppressed smell of human life. Idealism he scoffed at. Another colloquial artist was George Bellows. His views of the excavation for Pennsylvania Station show a Grand Canyon in the city, with late snow still on the floor of the crater. Steam and smoke billow up from the engines below. This is a view of the city as precipitous, dizzying. 42 Kids depicts the pale, gawky, knobbly bodies of working-class boys horsing around by the Hudson River on what was called Splinter Beach, a broken-down wooden pier. But Bellows' fascination with low life and high testosterone found its main subject in the prize fights that were held in semi-clandestine New York clubs with the ferocity of gang warfare. Prize fighting was illegal in New York, but that did nothing to stop it. And for Bellows, as for Hemingway and Norman Mailer later, it was a prime metaphor of manliness and survival, war in a smoky room. In Stag at Sharky's, the boxers form an arch joined only at their heads. The faces are bloody speed blurs, the pigment fat and vivid, the bodies starkly gleaming. Along the ringside are the heads of the spectators that put you in mind of Daumier. The most lyrical and politically the most acerbic of the Ashcan artists was John Sloan, a spectator of life, as he called himself, looking at a less violent world than Bellows. In election night, he sets down a more benign crowd, a throbbing, chaotic bunch of New Yorkers making whoopee under the elevated railway. Sloane's work had an honest humaneness, a frank sympathy. He refused to flatten lower-class New Yorkers into stereotypes of misery. It is the poor who emigrate, and the poor don't bring Titians with them. But in America, the immigrants created a new popular culture, the folk art of the urban crowd. Its great instrument was the silent movie, which crossed all the barriers of language and spoke to every level of the American Tower of Babel, precisely because it was silent. Its supreme exponent was Charlie Chaplin, an emigrant from the East End of London. Chaplin's tramp enacts the difficulties and humiliations of the immigrant underdog, the constant struggle at the bottom of the American heap. And yet he triumphs over adversity without ever rising to the top, thereby staying in touch with his audience. Chaplin's films were also deliciously subversive. The bumbling officials enable the immigrants to laugh at those they fear. But because silent cinema was entertainment and not art, people didn't resist it. It largely escaped controversy. It changed the perceptions of a whole society, but it was tolerated and welcomed. Painting and sculpture, high art, were a different matter. Not many Americans cared about changes in their language, but those who did care saw modernism as a threat to civilization itself. In art, America really disliked the new at first. Like cinema, modern art was an immigrant too, and it was treated accordingly. When a conservative critic in New York called Cubism and Fauvism Ellis Island art, his readers knew exactly what he meant, that it was foreign, incomprehensible, Jewish. Now, the taste for modernism developed quite slowly at first, and it was mainly fostered by one man, the son of a wealthy German Jew in New York who ran a tiny gallery at 291 Fifth Avenue and backed the artists who he believed were radicals and risk-takers. His name was Alfred Stieglitz. Stieglitz was, as a friend said, the John the Baptist in the desert of American art. His gallery was the first in New York to show Picasso, Cézanne, Matisse, and he fought for early American modernists too. Stieglitz's commitment to modernism laid the ground for the most influential art show ever put on in America. Here in the New York Armory in 1913, modern art became a public issue for the first time in America. The Armory show was put together by a committee of artists and others who wanted to create a sort of giant overview, a manifesto of new art both in Europe and in America. It contained work by Cézanne, Matisse, Gauguin, Van Gogh, Picasso, Brancusi, and scores of others. And most of the 70,000 New Yorkers who flocked to see it had never been exposed to anything resembling this kind of imagery. They, like the journalists and the critics who wrote about it, were both horrified and vastly amused by the spectacle. And the lesson that most of them took home from the Armory was that modern art was weird and foreign and deeply un-American.
Cubists are making insanity pay. Kenyon Cox, member of the National Academy.
Nobody who has been drinking should be let in to see this show. It is a disgrace to New York's
Mon Dieu,
tradition of art.
they have hang him, my masterpiece, upside down.
These figures are a useless pastiche. Younger American artists would be far better avoiding these daubs and childish marks.
This painting became the star freak of the Armory show, its bearded lady or its two-headed chicken. People compared it to an explosion in a shingle factory or to an earthquake on the subway. And it is, of course, Nude Descending a Staircase by Marcel Duchamp. A brown painting in a Cubist idiom, though, as a matter of record, the Cubists themselves didn't like it very much. The fame it has today is the fossil of the enormous notoriety that was dumped on it in 1913 as a puzzle picture. It's gone into the pantheon because it embodies the idea that the truly new work of art, like a prophet, has to be scorned and stoned by the ignorant mob before ascending into museum heaven. The nude was based in part on the sequential photos studying movement done by the French photographer Marais and the Englishman Edward Muybridge. It's no more advanced as such than any other Cubo-futurist painting, but the media created its fame.
But for me it was a great break, of course, from Impressionism and Fauvism and all the movements before. And the painting was shown in New York then in 1913. And that was supposed to be a break in my life because it was a succès de scandale. And I took advantage of it.
Duchamp's effect on the American avant-garde was enormous. Partly it came from his ready-mades, common objects, most notoriously this urinal, which he simply declared to be a work of art and entitled Fountain, flowing in reverse, as it were. He also wanted the work to include chance, to enlist accident as a co-author, as with his most famous work, The Large Glass, or The Bride Stripped Bare by Her Bachelors even.
Yes, they put the two panes on top of one another on a truck, flat, not knowing what they were carrying, and bouncing for 60 miles in Connecticut. So that's what happened. But the more I look at it, the more I like the cracks because they're not like shattered glass. They have a shape. There's a symmetry in the cracking. There's almost an intention there, a ready-made intention, in other words, that I respect and love.
The large glass, with its nebulous bride floating about in the upper half and sending her mating calls to the adoring bachelors below, was an ironic parody of profane love, but it remains a fairly hermetic work. Duchamp's greater influence was through his ready-mades. There was no context in 1913 in which an American could imagine a bicycle wheel mounted on a stool as a work of art. They were shocking in their time, and they keep their refined wit, despite 75 years of imitation by later artists and endless academic theses. Duchamp opened the work of art to the play of jokes, puns, irreverent gestures. He was a great abattoir of sacred cows, though he was wrong when he claimed that the only works of art America had given the world were her plumbing and her bridges. Still, how could an artist not feel the current of modernist power that New York embodied? How would Stieglitz's American artists interpret the brutal, ever-changing lyricism of the city? John Marin imagined the Brooklyn Bridge imbued with energy, fragmented, dancing. But the painter who responded most strongly to America's machine and power culture was Joseph Stella, an emigrant from Naples. For him, too, the Brooklyn Bridge was a key emblem. He painted it several times, calling it the shrine, containing all the efforts of the new civilization of America, the eloquent meeting of all the forces rising in a superb assertion of their powers, an apotheosis. He imagined the Gothic arches of the bridge as a cathedral of progress, framing the clean, high towers of the city beyond, strung by cables linking earth and heaven, engineering as myth. In the same spirit, John Marin rendered the streets and towers of Manhattan as explosive, toppling, disassembled by the human energy they reflect. The skyscrapers, those emblems of thrust and high technology bristling up from the bedrock of Manhattan Island, had made a cityscape like no other in the world. Georgia O'Keeffe in the early 20s painted them several times, the dark cliffs with rivers of electricity between and coloured light on their spires and finials. And by day, the Shelton Hotel, its bulk half dissolved in steam, and the halation patterns that O'Keeffe, though she was never a photographer herself, had copied from photographs. For these New York modernists, the Homer of the machine age was Walt Whitman, the poet who had brought technological America into consciousness. He seemed as mighty a bridge between the 19th and 20th centuries as this one was between Manhattan and the rest of America. In 1920, two photographers, Charles Sheeler and Paul Strand, made a 6-minute film of the city and called it Manhattan. It was constructed around Whitman's verses. City of the world, for all races are here. City of tall facades of marble and iron. 1 million-footed Manhattan, unpent, descends to its pavements. High growths of iron, slender, strong, splendidly uprising towards clear skies. Sheila turned this image from Manhattan into a painting, stressing the clean plains of the buildings and the pattern of the city in strong light. His photographs bred his paintings. They acted as ideas for further stages of abstraction. After the Armory show, American modernists tended to define themselves in terms of the new city and the machine, partly because, in the eyes of Europeans, that was the unique side of American culture. But Sheila took this to an extreme. For him, the industrial sublime replaced the natural sublime. And since any tendency in art worth its salt was expected to become an ism, Sheila called his precisionism. Precisionism indicated both style and subject. In fact, the subject was the style. Exact, hard, flat, big, industrial, and full of references to photography. Photography fed into painting and vice versa. Anything live and organic, like trees or people, was kept out of it, and there was no such thing as a precisionist pussycat. The ideal precisionist site was something like this, and yet it was a deeply romantic movement, adoring the good machine, the clean-cut primary forms of technological America. The man who builds a factory builds a temple. The man who works there worships there. Nothing symbolized this bizarre piety of American capitalism better than River Rouge. The capital of Henry Ford's automotive empire was now the biggest industrial plant in the world. Ford viewed industry as the new American religion. He thought it would lead to a United States of the world, with himself as an industrial messiah, the complete anti-humanist. Men could be treated like machinery. The defective human body could be fixed with new interchangeable parts. Machinery, he wrote, is accomplishing in the world what man has failed to do by preaching propaganda or the written word. The Ford Motor Company hired Sheila to spend 6 weeks in River Rouge, taking official photographs that reflect this fantasy of the machine as cult object. Tiny workers serve enormous clean machines like this stamping press. There is no hint of the boring, dehumanizing, and sometimes dangerous nature of production line work. The managerial elite had found its ideal artist in Sheila. His crisscrossing conveyor belts at River Rouge match the buttresses of Chartres Cathedral, which he photographed 2 years later. In a panorama of River Rouge called American Landscape, which he painted in 1930, the factory is all, and man is a single lonely ant. Was he commenting on the crash of '29, in whose wake Ford ruthlessly cut wages, fired armies of workers, and fixed machine guns at the gates? Among the rain and lights, I saw the figure 5 in gold on a red fire truck, moving tense, unheeded, to gong clangs, siren howls and wheels rumbling through the dark city. Demuth's most famous picture, done in 1928, was a precursor of pop art, a big glittering numeral, a sign for its own sake, called I Saw the Figure 5 in Gold. It was inspired by an imagist poem by his friend William Carlos Williams. Demuth puts in the streetlights, the red back of the truck, and the engine company number 5 receding down the street. But were the city and the machine the only themes of early American modernism? Not at all. For America's greatest 20th century architect, Frank Lloyd Wright, nature was the permanent inspiration. This is one of his early buildings, the Roby House, built in a Chicago suburb in 1909. He called this his prairie style. It's horizontal. Today, we're used to horizontal houses. But 90 years ago, Americans felt their homes should look like Greek temples or Gothic boxes, not ground huggers like this one, with its wide, strong eaves, every line expressing kinship with the flat, flat earth of the Midwest. Wright objected to the idea of dividing the space of a house into separate cubicles and permanent rooms. He loved classical Japanese tea house and farmhouse architecture in which space is altogether more permeable and fluid, not walled off but divided by sliding screens. And out of this idea he developed the open plan, which lies at the heart of so much modernist architecture. And it's there very early in his work, as here. Wright's genius as a planner is the channel through which the lessons of Japan flowed into the American mainstream. The massive stone fireplace recalls the social anchorage of the Japanese hearth. The detailing is very sophisticated, but it's not ornamental. It fuses with the design idea that he summed up in the term organic architecture, the belief that space, material and furniture should compose an organic whole, not just be a collection of things in a box.
My mother was a teacher and she wanted an architect for her son. I happened to be the son, and of course, naturally an architect. I was conditioned by her. The room into which I was born was hung with the wood engravings of the English cathedrals made by Timothy Cole. So I was born into architecture.
Wright began as a draftsman in Louis Sullivan's office in Chicago and inherited his mantle. He had the longest career of any American architect, and he still casts the longest shadow. No designer was ever more aware of the interrelatedness of nature's systems or strove harder to embody them in his work. He was also capable, as geniuses sometimes are, of astonishing arrogance. Nowhere is this clearer than in his design for the Guggenheim Museum in New York. As a pure building, as creation of space, the Guggenheim is one of the great inventions of the 20th century, with that spiral ramp that draws you slowly up towards the light flooding from the shallow dome. But its contents, the paintings and sculpture, have to fight the slope of the floor, jammed into the angled bays. It's Wright's gesture of indifference to arts he thought were inferior to his own. The house that fully shows the lyric relation between culture and nature that Frank Lloyd Wright sought is in the woods of Pennsylvania. It doesn't announce itself suddenly, all in one piece, like a mansion in a park. You catch glimpses of it through the trees, like the partial views that you get of a Japanese tea house in its garden. Your expectation rises, and then bingo, the whole thing with those magnificent cantilevered terraces jutting out above the rocks and a cascading stream. It's called Falling Water, and Wright designed it in 1936 for a Pittsburgh department store heir called Edgar Kaufman. For me, without exaggeration, this is the most beautiful American house since Jefferson's Monticello, and it becomes so by its play between nature and culture, with those great forms seeming to hover above the elements of nature and yet rooted in them. The noise of the water made it a trying house to live in, but that needn't worry the visitor. It's a wonderful set of variations on themes: the liquid water surface and the hard skin of glass, the cut fieldstone masonry and the raw rock ledges, the sense that the bulk of the building is cradled in that rock, while at the same time the balconies fly out into the air, working against gravity. All the opposites held in a poetic synthesis. Artists, too, believed that nature could underwrite their work even as it pushed towards abstraction. If European pioneers of abstract art like Kandinsky believed that, why not Americans? In the 19th century, American artists had equated nature with spirit, with creation itself. They saw it as the ground of American uniqueness. An impulse like that doesn't just suddenly evaporate, and so, in the early 20th century, the avant-garde was rich in images of land, sea, sky, plants, earth and moon, as nature and abstraction converged. One especially lyrical talent in the early American avant-garde, part of Stieglitz's circle, was Arthur Dove, who for some years lived on a boat in Long Island. His early abstractions still reflect the world. In this one, from about 1912, Sails, you can see the triangular mainsails against the cloud and landscape shapes behind. Like some European avant-gardists, Dove wondered if shape and colour could also convey an impression of sound, if there could be a match between painting and music. And in this grey seascape called foghorns, the soft blooms of shape do suggest the echo of those horns in the mist. For some American modernists, Long Island wasn't far enough away. Some American modernists went west, looking for primitive America, in search of nature stripped bare. They found it 2,000 miles away in New Mexico, around Santa Fe, Albuquerque, and especially Taos. Taos had been an art colony for years before any modernists got there. Since 1900, minor academic artists like Ernest Blumenschein had gone there to paint the Pueblo Indians, the adobe churches, and the landscape. By 1915, organised tourism had turned the place into a sort of internal American Tahiti with its own art marketing organisation. But the artist who came to dominate our idea of New Mexico imagery was a woman, Georgia O'Keeffe. Some of her earliest abstractions from the 19-teens are very beautiful. Their response to landscape is luminous, almost pantheistic. Once in New Mexico, she reacted intensely to the images of its culture, like the crosses erected by the penitentes, stark against the big sky. Her close-ups of flowers were very popular, both for their lushness and for their sexual overtones, whose presence O'Keeffe indignantly denied. Her paintings of skulls and pelvises in the landscape mostly verge on kitsch surrealism. Georgia O'Keeffe died in 1986, just 2 years short of her 100th birthday, and this was her house and studio in Abiquiu, New Mexico. Was she one of the greatest American artists? Well, there's certainly many people who think so. I'm not so sure, but this is confused by the fact that for the last 50 years of her life, she was unquestionably the most famous woman artist that America has ever produced. She was a diva of independence, an icon of feminism, and God help anybody who had the temerity to suggest that there might have been, let's say, some unevenness in her work.
I can imagine myself being a much better painter and nobody paying any attention to me at all. But it happens that the thing that I have done, the things that I've been doing have been in touch with my time so that people have liked it.
Georgia had to be moved emotionally by something in nature in order to paint it. But she let that first feeling rest inside of her for a year. And then we'd go back to the same place. And she might just sit and look at it a while, and then we'd go back 6 months later and she'd go to work on it. She could not stay in New York. 6 months there was all she could take. And then she would come out here and go to work, and work 11 hours a day was not unusual. Then there was the hiatus of taking a walk, which was sort of a rebuilding of this thing of the spirit. She wanted to work. That was the whole point of Georgia. She wanted to work.
O'Keeffe had shown her work at Stieglitz's gallery since 1916. They became lovers and later married, and Stieglitz photographed her incessantly, both clothed and nude. Their relationship was a scandal at first, then it became a legend, and finally a middlebrow soap opera like The Loves of Bloomsbury. We have talked over everything, Stieglitz wrote. Into 1 week we have compressed years. I don't think there is anything to equal it. Stieglitz disliked going west of the Hudson, but O'Keeffe moved to New Mexico in 1929. Marcel Duchamp once said that the fame of an artist depends on the multiplication of small anecdotes, and O'Keeffe certainly had her fair share of those. Her immense aura today has more to do with legend and gender politics than with her actual achievement as an artist, which doesn't quite measure up to that of Dove or Marsden Hartley. But she was still a very considerable painter, an American original. O'Keeffe first went to New Mexico as a guest of Mabel Dodge, a rich hostess with a radical artistic political salon in New York, who had moved to Taos and married a Pueblo Indian named Tony Lujan. They built a house in the Pueblo style on the outskirts of the town. She wanted, she said, to throw a bridge between two different kinds of consciousness, the ancient collective blood knowledge, as she called it, of the Indians, and the inventive mindset of Western modernism. Put these together, and Taos would become a city on the hill, the center of a new kind of American civilization. Mabel Dodge Lujan was a mystagogue and an egotist, and in many ways a very trying woman. But there was something undeniably impressive about her, and she did great things for the cause of Indian rights in the Southwest. In her role of talent collector, she made sure that no visiting artist could escape her relentless hospitality. When D.H. Lawrence and his wife Frida came to Taos, it was in this place that they stayed. And the prudish author of Lady Chatterley's Lover was so alarmed by the sight of Mabel Lujan cavorting naked in her bathroom that he covered its windows with totemic designs.
The value of the ground plane here, the way you've painted it, is the same as the vertical.
Today, as one of the registered tourist sites of old-style frontier modernism in the Southwest, the house is a mecca for Sunday painters.
Lightest in value other than the sky itself, because it's receiving the light of the sky and the sun most directly.
The Taos of today isn't much like the Taos of the 1920s. It's become a high Sierra theme park full of faith healers, wannabe witches, dealers in multicultural kitsch, all flashing their silver and turquoise concho belts at one another. Yet this character was already beginning to emerge 75 years ago. One of the artists, Mabel Luhan, invited there, hated its art colony as self-conscious, self-absorbed, and called Taos the stupidest place I ever fell into. He was a bristling and unhappy man, lately returned from the wider sphere of Europe, and he was America's finest early modernist painter, Marsden Hartley. He loved the New Mexican landscape as much as he disliked its white inhabitants. I am an American discovering America, he said. Any one of these beautiful canyons is a living example of the splendor of the ages, and I am bewitched by their magnificence and austerity. It is the only place in America where true color exists. It is not a country of light on things. It is a country of things in light. He had learned from Cézanne and Kandinsky, but the great American influence on Hartley was Albert Pinkham Ryder, the visionary 19th century artist whose mysticism spoke directly to Hartley's own. He remembered seeing his first canvas by Ryder, just some sea, some clouds, and a sailboat on the tossing waters, he wrote. I felt as if I had read a page of the Bible. All my essential Yankee qualities were brought forth out of this picture. It had the stupendous solemnity of a Blake. Hartley's real maturity as an artist had begun with his visit to Berlin in 1913 on the eve of World War I. Hartley was homosexual, and the strong gay subculture of pre-war Berlin enraptured him. It was tied to military pomp and pageantry, the cult of the warrior. Hartley's Berlin paintings were full of army regalia, badges, helmets. They were the most complete assimilation of Cubism by any American painter up to then. They were also coded love tokens to his German boyfriend, a young cavalry officer named Kurt von Freiberg. In Berlin, painted in 1914, Hartley idealizes his lover as Siegfried, the embodiment of chivalric purity, the White Knight. It was, of course, the age of iron, of blood and iron, Hartley wrote, bursting with organized energy, and the tension is terrific and somehow most voluptuous in the feeling of power, a sexual immensity. Von Freiberg was killed in the first months of the war, and the grief-stricken Hartley evoked his memory in his plumed helmet, his regimental numbers, the Iron Cross, and his initials KVF. Hartley's paintings, mourning the lover taken from him by the state, used the emblems of state power to reconstitute his memory. After he returned to America in 1915, Hartley couldn't even show his German elegies there. Anti-German fever ran so high that even performances of Mozart and Beethoven were barred, and patriots were kicking Dachshunds to death on the street. The victory of 1918 sealed the confidence of New York. The writer F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote of the returning troops marching down Fifth Avenue, this the greatest nation on earth, a wild gala in the air. The festivities would last right through the 20s until Prohibition drove them partially underground and made the gala wilder still because illicit. It was indeed the Jazz Age, with its parties at the mansions of New York Gatsbys. This was the kind of reward an immigrant could reach for when and if he really connected to the American dream. A Medicean palace in the 16th century Florentine manor, built above the Hudson River for a Sicilian named Antony Campagna, who came penniless off the boat around 1900 and became a property tycoon. Dilapidated now, but then, with its colonnades and frescoes that Campagna could never have had if he'd stayed in Sicily, a declaration of arrival that nobody could contradict. The Wall Street crash devastated the economy and had its effects on culture too. It wasn't that artists suddenly started making different kinds of art, though some did, but the general environment changed. They found themselves in a field of uncertainty and doubt. New York's great collective work of art had been itself. Between 1900 and 1930, it had turned itself into the exemplary modernist city, the capital of change, infused with a giddy sense of possibility and freedom, a belief in cultural and political progress that was open to the world. Now all that hope would falter in the face of the breadlines and the shanty towns, the ideological fights and the bitterness of Depression America. It would be a long time before it won back anything like the sense of optimism and promise that was open to its citizens in the age of immigration.